mosaic of all of these MOSs at the various and sundry grades. Well, you can't control the number of guys get promoted to Spec 4. That's done by the local commander. But you can, through varying the scores, you can control the number of people getting promoted to grade E5 and E6. You can manipulate the bonus, and you can control the re-up rates. You can manipulate the re-up bonuses for transfers. So there are a whole variety of tools in a toolkit that you can manipulate, but it takes a staff to understand the synergy between all of these pots of resources. Call up the recruiting command, tell them put in another 100 guys in MOSX, but you won't get them out for a year. So there's some things that work immediately, change the bonus overnight, and people will sign up. So a variety of things that you can, tools in the toolkit.
You understand the tools. What I was wondering about was how could you do one on a weekend when there's so much, not only the synergy and interactiveness of the tools, but also the MOSs themselves are interactive in that if you're short in combat arms and over in certain support specialties, to bring down the support specialties, you offer incentives to transfer into the combat arms or disincentives to stay in the Army, whatever.
Well, Milpersen is an extraordinary place. In the bowels of Milpersen, there are people that have made their life there that can tell you an enormous amount about human behavior. So, for example, they can tell you the elasticity of support people migrating to combat arms if the right amount of money is put into it.
They know
Who does that? Who does that is principally the guy who migrated out of the combat arms into the sport ranks for some reason way back yonder when his wife told him it was time to get out of that bracket, or he got tired of it, or ran into the wrong group of people, or spent too much time in the field. Now he's 2 grades higher, and he's not pulling the tracks on the tank anymore. He's going to be a tank commander, and he says, I know how to do that. I'll go back and do that. So what is important in that kind of work is data. You have to know how to use and manipulate the data. Now, the neat thing about it is you can meet the next month, and if you had more takers than you estimated, you'd know that automatically the next month. You turn the valve off.
turn the valve off, yeah.
So by doing this repetitively once a month, instead of sort of being a dilettante and dropping in once a year, you got a feel for what worked and what didn't work. And so it was one of the things about it is it was an extraordinary learning curve about how the systems of the Army work.
So you do the whole gamut of MOSs once a month,
Yeah.
rather than
Yeah.
just one MOS.
Didn't do one. No,
Okay, I
we did
misunderstood.
one MOS a month. I'm sorry, we did one CMF, one career
Okay.
management field, like artillery or
Right.
like infantry or like armor. We did one of those a month in order to see how it was going to be 2 years downrange
Okay, so that's a long term.
for the weapon systems and that kind of stuff. Issue orders to the training base, etc. But for the manipulation of the bonuses, etc., did that once a month, did all of them.
The whole, yeah, I got you. Okay. That makes sense. In the leadership department, you told me things that have been, action that has been taken, schools being set up and so on, for NCOs. Was the behavior of leaderships targeted for change? Was there some new way that you or you and Shy or the head shed wanted to move leadership? Did you want to teach people to be empowering leaders, for example, or open communications, or
Yeah, I think if you look at leadership, first thing is you have to have what could best be termed as a leadership development model. And the Army has a pretty good model. And one of the things we did was codify the model. Intuitively, you know what the model is, but if it's codified, you can begin to study it and embellish it and help it to fruition. The Army's leadership model is sending a person to a school to prepare that person, he or she, him or her, to discharge the duties they are about to undertake in the force. That educational opportunity says that you are now qualified to be a platoon leader, or you're now qualified to be a company commander, or you're now qualified to be a battalion commander. And then there is a practicum where you get a chance to go and be a company commander. Now let's just use that illustratively for a moment. Then the model continues based upon the counseling you get as a company commander while you're in that particular responsible job. And then you are evaluated to see whether you should be given additional schooling to prepare you to command at a higher level, to be a leader at a higher level, or conversely, based upon your practicum as a company commander, you are determined not fit to command at a higher level, and therefore you may be either relegated forever to staff work, or you may be deselected. Now that model then begins to put demands on the system that you teach the right leadership in the residence phase, that you get people to, and it puts pressure on the Army itself, the institution of the Army, because now it says you must be given the opportunity to do that before you go into command. So from that flows orders which came down after we looked at them, is we don't want you putting into command anybody that had been in the advanced course. I mean, it used to be that nobody gave a damn about that, just put you in command. But since the early 1980s, I think the codification and understanding of our system has said, essentially, that we want captains to be in command. It'll be the very rare lieutenant that does that. We expect the captain who's in command to have been a graduate of his company or battery school at the advanced course level, so that he has the theoretical undergirding necessary to prepare him to be a commander at that level. We are uniquely, as opposed to American industry, we are willing to deselect people out of the Army so that they can inflict their lousy command qualities on other people. Because in our profession, we believe that the soldier has a Bill of Rights. And the soldier's Bill of Rights is that, among other things, that the soldier has a right to good leadership. So we don't tolerate lousy leaders. So the codification of that model, simplistic though it may be, begins to give you the capability to say, how will we construct our residence training program? what shall be the evaluation system we put into the field? Counseling system with a form up front that tells you what it is you're supposed to do. The participatory nature of you got to fill out a poop sheet to report to your commander what it was you thought you did well and how you thought you performed your mission while in the rating period. And then finally, the rating system itself, which is true. You're trying to reduce the inflationary notion about it, and we've been pretty successful with that. So there then becomes, then the second leg of that stool becomes, one is a schoolhouse stool. Second leg of the stool is what is the responsibility of the commander in professional development while he is a commander for his troops that are below him, whether it be civilian or non-commissioned officers or soldiers themselves, or whether they be officers. So we teach that in our school system, that there has to be a professional development school, and you're responsible for running it. And then the third leg of the stool we teach and codified and thought about and put on the paper is that the officer himself or herself has a responsibility for self-education. So if you look at the, if you look sort of at the, it's a three-legged stool that has residence education and leadership, self-education in leadership when you're not in residence, and the practicum of leadership combined with the professional development that you encourage in your unit. Those become sort of the three hallmarks of our professional development and leadership gamut. So getting all that codified, I'd say we started that in 1981. And it's 10 years in the making to get that pretty well nailed. That's what it was doing. Meyer contributed to it, and while the DESPER remained the staff agency responsible for it, in the period that Carl was the chief of staff, he put up at Leavenworth, we codified at Leavenworth a leadership sort of institute out there. And we put a group of people out there to make sure that there was a refurbishment of leadership and connectivity with the schoolhouse and that kind of stuff. I think it's still being out there. Now, it's not to say leadership was discovered in 1981. I mean, there's no intent about that.
No, I was just wondering if
what I'm
if it was
suggesting
tweaked,
to you
in a certain
is
direction.
that with Jack Marsh's year on leadership, people who, I mean, you go back and look, Shy taught leadership at Fort Benning when he was a lieutenant or a captain. As I recall it, he had been to Korea, fought in Korea, and came back and was put in leadership department. So he brought with it a reservoir for leadership. But it's not to say that we haven't been practicing leadership for a long period of time, but the focus on the year of leadership sort of said it's a time to pull up socks and try to do better. Again, some of this is the aftermath of the Vietnam escapade that says that a lot of middle grade and young officers were disillusioned with the caliber of leadership they got in Vietnam in combat for a variety of reasons, ticket punching and every other damn thing. But they were demoralized about that in many respects. And therefore it was time now to begin to juice up leadership again. I guess one of the things that comes to mind is that I used to use in the recruiting command, used it when I was a desk spur, used it when I was a vice chief, used it when I was in TRADOC. It was a little less appropriate in Southern Command. But I used to use the 1 a month grant. That's what I call it. In other words, every month I had a different focus of activity, so that the subordinate elements focused on that, not to disregard everything else, but to learn more about the 1 a month grant, whatever it was we were doing for the month. Paul Gorman had sort of put that in my head. Paul was a division commander in the 8th ID. And that was sort of like in the late 70s. And I visited with Paul as both the chief of recruiting in the TRADOC and the PA&E, and I go over there and visit on occasion. And one of the things he did was he had an annual training program, and in January it was attack in a built-up area, Mount. The next month it was river crossings. The next month it was delay. The next one there was attack. You know, and it had a group of activities. And he persuaded me. Well, then he had a monthly call out of a battalion. And he, for example, in the month that it was river crossings, every battalion commander in the division knew that one of them would be called out to make a river crossing. And therefore, everybody studied river crossing. Now, if you go to the National Training Center today, you will find units who will not do well on certain basic military skills. And the reason they don't do it is because they presume that everybody knows how to do that. And therefore, it doesn't require study, rehearsal, review, after-action report, adjust, etc. You follow me? In other words,
Right.
Human nature is what human nature is.
Right.
So in my own book, I came up with a 1 a month grant and carried that on for, I guess all my executive leadership positions. Sort of for a period of, nominally 10 years, I did that. That was a technique I used both in a staff context and in a command context. Now, what I learned out of Jack Marsh's work of the annual yearly program push, whether it was a spirit of victory, whether it was leadership, whether it was physical fitness, whether it was values. If you think about values for a minute, and I ask you to talk to me for an hour about values at the departmental level, an hour about values at a major command level, an hour about values in the acquisition process, an hour about the level of values in behavior in organizations. You might struggle with that, because talking about values is not a simple task to talk about. It is esoteric and requires some thought to put a squeeze on it in order to be able to articulate what it is you mean by all that. So when Jack ran these annual programs, it caused people to stop and sort of consider, well, what have we been doing in the past? What is our history about this? Have we learned anything? Is it time for a renewal of commitment, a renewal of resources, a renewal of techniques, etc.? So as we looked at the leadership program, these things began to pop out. Now let me take that down now through the 4 years, 2 years as the per and 4 years as the vice, and now the commander of trade-off. One of the things that I internalized through all this process is that you want to replicate in the schoolhouse everything that you can in order to enhance the qualities of the soldier coming out of the schoolhouse to carry out his duties when he returns to his unit. And I don't know, I may have told you this before, I can't tell you what I told you, and then so wave me off if I run this down. But I got a hold of Ralph Halliday, and I said, I want you to have the BNOCs get with the recruits. And the last week of BNOCery, the sergeants in BNOC will take out a gun crew of recruits and conduct shooting operations with them.
These would be guys who are in the OSIP program?
Guys in the OSEP program,
Yeah.
they'll be in there last week. The BNOC students will be in there last week. What is it a sergeant is supposed to do in the field artillery? He's supposed to draw a howitzer, take it to the field, train his gun crew, and shoot bullets accurately.
So that's what they do for the last week?
Yeah,
They'd be in charge of one
Right.
crew, they'd have the same guys every day?
right. Now, guess who was against that?
Well, I think the whole schoolhouse would be against that.
Whole schoolhouse was against that, particularly the non-commissioned officers. We don't have to do this. We know how to do this.
You mean the guys who are in BNOC? Or the?
Not the guys in the BNOC, guys in the faculty
Who are running the
who
BNOC?
run the BNOC, et cetera. So I said, no, that's what we're gonna do.
That's great.
So we started this program. Now you had to draw, in the case of the artillery, and then we normally did this on 105s and 155s. You had to draw the prime motor, inventory it with all the billy on board. You had to draw the howitzer and inventory it with all the billy on board. He had to draw ammunition. He had to get his 10 people who were going to be his gun crew. He had to check them out to see which one was going to be the number 1 man and number 2 guy and all that stuff, the gunner. Had to put them through Cannonier's hop to figure out who was talented about that. He had to run through and make sure that the guy that was cutting the charges knew what he was doing, the guy cutting the fuse knew what he was doing. Are these the jobs he would have to do if he was a gun chief in an artillery unit in the force? You bet. Was he able to get this as sort of a free good inside the schoolhouse? Yes. Did it also demonstrate to him the quality coming out of the training base? Yes, because he was immediately tacked on to this group of people, and he realized then what they knew and what they didn't know, and he realized what he would have to teach them that hadn't been taught in the schoolhouse, if in fact that was the case. And all of this was under the supervision of the schoolhouse. So if he made some dastardly mistake, he wouldn't kill anybody, as he might if he was in a real live unit someplace back in Fort Swampy.
Might he flunk out of the course?
He could get recycled. Wouldn't flunk him on that, might recycle him, say you gotta do some work here. But think about this a minute, from the point of view of putting pressure on the BNOC student, but doing it in a non-pejorative fashion, which says then that he's not hurting anybody's life you know, if he gets to the force, because we had safety officers, people around to make sure it went right. So I called up Ralph after, Ralph Halliday was the guy down, so I called him up about 2 weeks after the first demo, and I said, okay, give me a dump. Oh, by the way, they had to draw the M16s, and they had to draw machine guns. And they had to fire M16s, fire machine guns. Had to fire the weapon, zero it, and get ready to fire it in the field against targets, and then they had to fire the machine gun out in the field. So I called Raphael 2 weeks later. Huh?
It's a big week.
Big week.
And were they,
What duties are they doing? They're doing the duties you do in the Army in a howitzer unit. That's what they're doing.
right, and they're doing it in a sort of a protected environment.
You bet.
And
So I said, what about it? He said, well, I got all the catenary in and they gave me a dump. He said, they have never seen the amount of studying going on by the students in the B9. He said it was up all night for the week ahead of time, practicing with each other, going through the drills with each other, reading the manuals. Terrific. Best training ever been done in Fort Sill, Oklahoma.
That's
Okay,
it.
so I said, now you do know what we're going to do next, don't you? And no, I don't know what we're going to do. So I said, well, we're going to take the ANOC guys, because the ANOC guy is supposed to have a platoon.
Right.
So now we have an ANOC guy, take 2 BNOC guys
In 2 sections.
in 2 sections,
Lay the battery.
and he's got to lay the battery, he's got to shoot the bullets. He's going to be a safety officer. Said 2 weeks after that, and I said, what happened? He said, never have we ever seen the ferocity of study going on with the manuals by the ANRs. Now, how does this get back to the leadership model? Leadership model says, we're going to prepare you for your job in the unit, in the schoolhouse. So we're going to teach you how to do that. And you're going to get a chance to demonstrate that in the schoolhouse. Oh, by the way, if you don't cut that, then we'll have to recycle you to make it better. Now, I mean, obviously you could flunk out later, but that's the case. Now, we did that in the infantry. We did that in the artillery. We did that in the engineers. We did that in every one of the activities in training. Which then says, we're doing a leadership training task inside the schoolhouse to further the leadership skills of the guy outside. In other words, we're putting a practicum at work inside the schoolhouse to reinforce the skills that you would do outside. So the year of leadership, you know, continues on in the Army. I mean, now, my view is you may have to juice it up again in the mid-90s in order to make sure people haven't forgotten what it is they're supposed to get. 15 years, you know, it's time to rejuice it. Once a year, having a thing go on in the Army, in my book, is not bad. I applaud Marsh for that. I am convinced that tail hook would never have occurred in the Army.
Might have occurred in 1955.
Well, it might have occurred in the mid-70s.
Yeah.
But after we went through our value year, review of values, after Wickham put out the order to stop drinking on duty.
When was that?
Oh, like 1984 or 5. Came in one day and asked me, what would I think about abolishing happy hour? Right on.
Revolutionary. I mean, you've got some cronies who have guts. 'Cause
Yeah.
They're willing to change
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. And everybody said, well, geez, the clubs will go belly up. I said, fine, if they go belly up. If they've been operating on the basis of catering and pandering to people's immorality, we're going to stop it. So my view is that really the tail hook would not have occurred. After all that, I mean, we simply de-glorified and de-glamorized alcohol. And we also said we're willing to take the consequence of not doing it. I mean, the AUSA things got pretty tame after that. Used to be they ran around on the floors and all that bullshit. They don't do that anymore. Gotten to be a serious professional kind of session.
It's a very different Army from the one.
And is anybody not liking it? No, most people who like the Army still like the Army. It reminds me of the days in which I was the pay officer in 1954, when I finally got to a unit. And I used to draw the money in cash and pay the troops, and the company commander, battery commander gave the money out to the troops and all that. I remember when somebody came along and said, check the bank. I remember people saying, can't give checks to the bank. The reason you can't give checks to the bank is because if you don't pay a guy across the pay table, you will not build up that response to leadership that he knows that you're working for him. You remember hearing that?
Oh, yes. Face to face, company commander.
Yeah, unless I pay that guy, he won't know who he's working
Who
for.
his boss is, right?
Think about that for a minute. I mean,
Well, it
you
sounded
know,
like bullshit
if you
then.
think that that is leadership, I mean, you know, you're just out to lunch. But I mean, people sincerely, absolutely sincerely believe that if you actually sent the money to banks, then it would demoralize the unit wouldn't be worth shit, and we'd be out to lunch. You know, nothing could be further from the truth. So, you know, you get some mistaken views about things, and you have to go back and sort of refurbish them and burnish them, and it's like polishing brass out there. You know, every now and then, you got to go out and take a blitz cloth and go polish the brass if you're going to keep the brass cleaned up. So the leadership thing was sort of giving a twist to it again, jump-starting it again, saying it's time for us to take a review of how we're doing leadership. Started with Shy, because Shy had been a leadership teacher before. He was very, you see, remember now, Shy was the assistant commandant at Carlisle when a bunch of that shit hit the fan up there about officers, the famous panel of officers that came up and said that senior officers were no damn good, and they were lying, cheating, and stealing, and
It was almost like a strike among the students, wasn't
Yeah.
it?
and he was either during that period of time or right before it or right after it. So he knew a lot of these guys, a lot of guys like Mike Malone and other people who made their living in leadership and had studied it and understood it and were talking about it and writing about it, and that became a good deal. And Starry had started a thing called the Delta Force down at famous downtown.
England or something like that?
No, he started down at Tradoc,
Oh.
which is a group of people on living systems theory about leadership and how you run large organizations and all that kind of stuff. And then I got this group of people to come in. Julius Beckton, for example, was one of the guys brought in because he was a respected leader. We sort of got fired up on leadership, and then Jack Marsh took it up as one of his year-long endeavors, and we made some money on it, made some headway on it.
From watching the guys running around in the woods in Fort Hunter Liggett, I got the impression that being a leader, sergeant or lieutenant or captain or colonel in a cohort unit was a great deal harder than being a leader in a, what you might call an old-fashioned or authoritarian unit, because the accessibility of the leader, the expectation of accessibility that subordinates had for their leader was higher, and the expectations of competence of the leader were higher. And this in turn then made every leader more dependent on his boss for support advice, manifestations of downward confidence, that sort of thing. And there were hints of this in the white paper that came out on leadership. There's a lot of it in a manual. It's called Soldier Team Building. It's one of the sort of sub-manuals under the leadership series. And I wondered if that was, if that kind of manual was a product of a consensus within the Army or just a small group of people who wrote the manual. And I wondered if there was
More the latter.
More the latter.
Yeah, most manuals are written not with the consensus of the Army, it's written with people at Leavenworth or elsewhere who are writing a manual, and it's vetted, but I mean, essentially it's not necessarily the consensus of the Army. The notion of it is to try to perpetrate it to become the consensus of the Army.
Okay. So it's the
Let me talk to you a little bit about why I believe the need for leadership is different in a cohort unit. I was in a cohort unit.
Yes, you were.
Now, I was not in the same battery for 5 years, but I was in the same division artillery for 5 years straight, at home and abroad. I believe that when you are in a unit for a very long period of time, you could go one of two directions. You can either get very good or you get very bad. And I think a lot of it depends upon the relationship between the command chain and the non-commissioned officers that are doing business, and what your mission is. Now, when you go to a place like Europe, you have a very definable and clear mission. So there's a series of maneuvers you got to go on, then there's a series of competencies you got to do, and you go to the training areas. You got to prepare your general defense plans, etc. So there's a whole panoply of things to do. And then the technical competency within a unit is one of those things that has to be highly maintained. When you are in a unit for an extravagant period of time, like 5 years, many things become easy to do. Getting a unit out of a caserne, I use the European model for a moment, getting the European unit out of the caserne into its local training areas, moving it from there to someplace, loading the rail cars or driving to grab convoy operations, going to grab beer or hauling those. Those things become pretty routine. I mean, because you're doing it all the time.
Got it.
And oh, by the way, you got the same chain of command doing it all the time. Battalion commander may change every 2 years, or 18 months in those days, or 2 years now. You get pretty skilled at that. Fall out the same sergeant, you got the same first sergeant, who's falling outside the company street for 5 straight years. Very comfortable with that. Now, in the 7th Division cohort, we had a different phenomenology going on there. First of all, we brought people directly from the training establishment into the division. And we appended to them the non-commissioned officer and officer corps. Now, we thought we had a model for doing that. Obviously, models are to be adjusted, and therefore, if we'd stayed long enough in the business, might adjust the way to do those models, but that's what we did. Now, from a human behavioralist standpoint, the model would tell you that the group that goes through basic and advanced individual OSUP training is going to have a substantial amount of internal cohesion in that unit. And therefore, the new NCO and new officers that are appended to it are going to have to establish and break into that group and get the loyalty of the group. So, every sergeant that is appended to that group, every first sergeant is appended to that group, platoon sergeant, squad leader, platoon sergeant, first sergeant, sergeant major are all appended to that unit. Have got a substantial amount of work to do.
They got selling to do, right?
Now, meanwhile, this unit was a different unit, so it had a new mission, and therefore the interpretation of how that mission was to be performed, there were no real guidelines at that particular time, and making them as a go. And, oh, by the way, in this particular case, with that particular division, we disrupted the conventional non-airborne, non-ranger life of the infantryman sergeant. What had happened over time in the 70s was that the infantry divisions had been burdened with substantial amounts of equipment. And since we did not have enough troops, many of the sergeants had to go and take care of this equipment. And therefore, they had become less competent and atrophied in their skills as soldiers moving through the woods without equipment. Now, the 82nd was still up to 100% strength, and units in Europe were full up in strength and the like, but in the main, the divisions in the United States were not at strength. And with an extraordinary amount of time being spent in the motor pools taking care of equipment, then many NCOs had lost their field craft. It just hadn't been practiced in a long time, so they weren't confiding better. So now you're taking away their vehicles, and now you're saying your vehicle is your feet. And oh, by the way, we're going to spend a lot of time in the field. So I think that there were two adjustments that were underway there. I think there was the cohesion factor, trying to get lined up with the cohort group that came in from the OSUT at Fort Benning. And I think there was also a reacclimation of the non-commissioned officer leaders to their new lot in life.
There was a lot of that, yes.
And many of them didn't like that. And we knew going in that we'd have some problems with that. So we tried to seed the 7th with some Rangers and guys that knew their field craft. But I think, now I haven't looked at all the data, but my horseback judgment about it is that you had two tasks. You had three tasks. You had the getting inside the cohesion and bonding game. You had carrying out the missions of the new unit and deriving the missions of the new unit and going through the drill of proving the worth of the new unit. And then you had the acclimation of an NCO Corps that had been a long time away from its field craft. And the soldiers were probably closer to the field craft than many of the non-commissioned officers, excluding the Rangers and the airborne that had been sent here. So there were some powerful forces going on inside that battalion organization. Some non-commissioned officers measured up to that, some captains measured up to that. Some Lutz did, some didn't.
That's right.
And people believe that, that's one reason we put together the light leaders course, is try to break through that in order to reacclimate some people who had been away from it and run through the school, make sure that they were up to speed about that. And that's a good program for them. So I think that there was a considerable amount of pressure on the unit. I mean, one, there was a Hawthorne effect at work. And then these other three effects were at the same time.
Then they took on a readiness mission, short-time deployability mission.
Yeah, which everybody ought to have. Everybody in the U.S. Army now is a contingency operator. And all we were doing is tell them in 1983, yes, you are too. Which up to that time, nobody had except the 82nd.
It really keeps people on their toes.
You bet. I think the proof comes when the 7th goes to Panama, and they do quite well there. They loaded out fast, they were able to do quite well. They were very good at field craft.
They're very adaptable also, all
Yep.
different missions. That was,
See, my view was the U.S. Army ought to have the world's finest infantrymen. And when I'm talking about infantrymen, I'm talking about a dismounted infantryman. I'm not talking about a mech infantryman in a mech vehicle. I'm talking about a mech infantryman outside the mech vehicle and all other infantrymen. Then it's the dismounted infantryman. He's got to be able to live on the land, move on the land, fight on the land, take advantage of the land.
it's a tall order, because not many of our people were raised on farms in Kentucky anymore,
You bet.
whereas a lot of people in other countries are raised on farms. Yeah, it's a big training order, but the guys in Panama, they rose to it.
I recall watching a guy had a rucksack, a gigantic rucksack in Panama, 7th ID guy. So I'm in the field, so how you doing, Trooper? He looked at me, he says, a piece of cake. He said, you know, you guys are the luckiest people going. I said, how's that? He says, you have the new MREs down here. I mean, he didn't tell me about how hot it was, and how big a load it was. In fact, if some of his buddies got shot or any of that stuff, he big, gigantic ruck going out and doing his thing in the field. Had terrific discipline. I mean,
Unbelievable.
in terms of,
It came from in here too, it didn't come
well, I
from.
mean, we just didn't have any incidents with them, with Panamanians or whatever. Had one incident. And terrific group of guys, and it was in stride. It was one of these things that, this is what we prepared for. We're good at this. Fight at night and fight in the day, and come in quickly and get on with it, move out rapidly and all that. Capesa did a terrific job as division commander, and troops were spectacular. Knew their field craft.
They had a fair number of NCOs who were graduates of previous cohort incarnations. Fantastic payoff, because they really knew how to take care of soldiers. They really knew field craft. And even some of the platoon sergeants who were from the old Army, but who had been through a cohort incarnation and then got the message and stayed for a second cohort. And that was really exciting to meet them after Panama, having met them when they were up to their eyebrows in the organization of the cohort. And they survived that, and then they were real masters of it in the second incarnation. They were tired. You work awfully hard in the light infantry.
Yeah.
You feel up for going into the beginning of your years as a vice, the problems that you dealt with there, or you want to break it?
What time is it, 13:30? Yeah, see if there's any personnel game.
Oh, one thing I wanted to ask you about was profiles. You said you had one or two words on
Oh,
the
yeah,
subject.
on profiles, one of the things we decided is that, you know, when we took an inventory about each one of these branches, we found out we had a zillion profiles in the infantry. Profile 3, which meant they weren't deployed. So wait a minute now. People are profile 3 and they're in the infantry. They expect to get promoted, but they can't go to combat. I mean, how could this guy be put in the 10th Mountain Division, or the 10th Division, or the 7th Division, or whatever? What the hell?
Well, even the 3rd Infantry Division.
Well, I mean, but how can they be out there? How can they be advancing in rank, but they're not deployed? Can't have this. So we put out a little policy there, which said we are going to take a hard view on profiles. And we will have a 100% screen of all profiles. And that if a guy is in the combat arms and he has got a profile that is not temporary in nature, then that individual will be transferred to one of the service support industry, but he won't be in the